This afternoon I'd like to talk to you about the ladies and gentlemen of Montreal. But before I start, let me take a side trip to Newport. And I'd like to talk about the gentlemen and ladies of Newport. In fact, the Newport Mercury reported on the opening of the new Touro Synagogue in its edition of 5 December 1763, in a text penned by Ezra Stiles. He described the beauty and decorum of the ceremony at which, quote, there were present many gentlemen and ladies, end quote. It is noteworthy that Reverend Stiles focused on the perceived socioeconomic status of the attendees. These people were bankers, cashier food exporters, foundry operators, manufacturers of soap, potash and products, and candles made from whale oil, shippers, and silversmiths. He focused on the fact that Newport's ladies and gentlemen were properly represented, and especially the ladies. The community was far from the outset engaged communally, socially, and economically. In that way, Newport was no different than many other Sephardic communities of the period. Let me now move to Montreal a few years later. In fact, only 5 years later, in 1768, Sherit Israel of Montreal was established. The ladies and gentlemen of Montreal were not that different, engaged as they were in all facets of life in the community. They involved themselves in a myriad of sectors: food distribution, the Board of Trade, banking, shipping, the fur trade, and public utilities. Business was at that time a man's world, but that by no means meant that the ladies sat passively by. On the contrary, women were at the fore in philanthropy and community service. Without the ladies of Montreal, communal life would not have been the same. The community had well-established links with other Sephardic communities, including most notably Bevis Marks in London and the Spanish and Portuguese Synagogue in New York. Many of the first settlers in what is now Canada were descended from survivors of the expulsion. The Montreal community's first Sefer Torah was a gift from Bevis Marks. The scroll is now in the National Archives in Ottawa. Later on, when the community was fundraising to build the Stanley Street Synagogue, the Spanish and Portuguese Synagogue of New York gave a donation of $500, on the understanding that the Montreal community would continue to follow the Orthodox Sephardic ritual. This understanding remains in force to this day. These brave and engaged 17th century families founded the first synagogue in Canada and laid the foundations of a vibrant and lasting tradition. The ladies and gentlemen of modern-day Montreal are also engaged in the community, acting notably as academics, business people, civil servants, elected officials, healthcare professionals, and jurists. Among the most influential ladies in recent times were the Wolfe sisters: Annette, Esther, Fanny, Rachel, Rosetta, and Sarah. They were proud descendants of the Aaron Hart and Abraham Joseph families. The family was devoted to the preservation of Jewish heritage, and in particular that of Sherit Israel. In 1992, Esther Blaustein and her husband Henry donated a number of personal papers to the National Library and Archives. This collection is of particular interest in that it contains documents pertaining to Rabbi Abraham de Sola's 1872 visit to Washington, D.C., a scroll commemorating the death of Mrs. Meldola de Sola's husband in 1918, the program of the 5th Women's Community Conference, which was attended by ladies from Montreal, Montefiore Joseph's diaries, and the record of Josette Joseph's trip to Europe and Israel. In 2001, Evelyn Miller, a member of the Hart and Joseph families, who co-authored a history of Sherit Israel in collaboration with her cousins Esther Blaustein and Rachel Essar, donated a collection of important archival documents to McGill University. Mrs. Miller was a committed archivist, having worked with the McCord Museum, the Archives Committee of Canadian Jewish Congress, the Montreal Jewish Historical Society, and Montreal's Jewish Public Library, where she served as honorary archivist throughout the 1970s. Then, in 2007, Annette Wolf and her sister Rosetta Elkin donated a significant collection of personal archival materials to the National Library and Archives. This collection is complementary to two others, the Congregation Sherit Israel 1778-1952 collection and the extensive Jacob M. Lowy collection. In addition to their devotion to history, they were staunch supporters of Jewish heritage, decorum in the Sephardic tradition, and sticklers for Derech Eretz. They never hesitated to speak up when newly arrived congregants from the Maghreb deviated from the established S&P protocol. This family of hyperactive sisters played key roles as historians and archivists. Moreover, the Wolf sisters were community volunteers and activists involved in a myriad of good works. These included Combined Jewish Appeal, the National Council of Jewish Women, and the Order of Nurses. In the larger French-speaking community, they participated actively in the Fédération des Femmes du Québec, which was founded in 1966 to promote women's rights and to foster feminist engagement in a number of key areas: access to pensions, civil marriage, pay equity, the right to maternity leaves, and the sponsorship of immigrants. These issues of most concern to activists involved in this movement were and continue to be the economic vulnerability of women, poverty, sex discrimination, and sexual violence. It is not difficult to understand the interest shown by Jewish women, including the Wolf sisters, in these societal issues. They were there shoulder to shoulder with their non-Jewish sisters to ensure that women's rights were respected and that women benefited from the full protection of the law. As the Montreal community grew through immigration, the family was also concerned with the integration of new French-speaking members of the community, hailing from both the Maghreb and the Mashrek. Consequently, new community institutions emerged. The Comité du Fait Français and the Comité des Relations Ashkénaze-Séfarades du Congrès Juif Canadien. The most exercised among the sisters in this regard was Rosetta Elkin, who was committed to promoting harmony and mutual understanding between those members of the community with natural historical allegiances to the English-speaking world and those who came to Canada from France, former French colonies, and other French-speaking countries, the vast majority of whom were Sephardim. Sherit Israel and English-speaking Jews clearly had a role to play. Fully engaged ladies like Rosetta Elkin made every effort to promote inclusion and respect. Her eye was not solely turned to her family's prestigious past. It was also turned to what she perceived to be the future of a well-integrated and culturally diverse Jewish community whose institutions should be there to support all Jews, whether they be Ashkenazi, Sephardic, English, or French-speaking. Her vision continues to guide this strategic orientation even today. Back home, within the community, the Wolf sisters were also involved in the synagogue sisterhood. The two who were most involved were Rachel and Esther. The ladies of the community had been meeting in the home of Mrs. Meldola de Sola when in 1918 they were asked to organize a sisterhood to fulfill certain communal functions: the decoration of the Sukkah, the encouragement of Jewish observances, entertainment for the festivals of Purim and Hanukkah, the organization of a Sunday school, providing greenery for Shavuot, as well as the repair and replacement of Torah vestments. From that time forward, sisterhood members were involved in philanthropy and community service, working with the Baron de Hirsch Institute providing food for needy children, and the Federation of Jewish Philanthropies providing articles of clothing for the poor. The level of service and community engagement was then extended to the Hebrew orphanage, the maternity hospital, the old folks home, and the social service department of the Jewish General Hospital. Today's sisterhood, co-chaired by Sandra Kuku and Grace Peerless Lowy, does not fulfill exactly the same mission, but it does ensure that today's ladies are fully engaged in the synagogue activities and cultural affairs. The more educational mandate originally assumed by the sisterhood has been taken on by the Women's Learning Group under the leadership of Gladys Mualem. Let us now look at the gentlemen of Montreal and the gentlemen in more recent times. These gentlemen have not been no less engaged. Two examples of unparalleled engagement in the community were Meyer Levy and Alan Rose. Let me begin with Meyer Levy. A lawyer educated in his native Egypt, Meyer served as Canadian Jewish Congress's Director of Community Relations from 1965 to 1984. During his nearly 20-year tenure, he drafted briefs on public issues of concern to the Jewish community and reviewed the press on a regular basis in order to identify stereotypes and examples of anti-Semitic or xenophobic discourse in the French language media. Sensitive questions were brought to the attention of Jewish community leaders. In addition, he even seized members of the Conseil de Presse, the press council, with these same contentious issues. His constant concern was the equitable treatment of his fellow Jews and their host society, and their ability to exercise their full measure of rights with dignity. Early on in his career, he helped establish the Cercle Juif de langue française, which published a French-language review, Les Cahiers du Cercle Juif de langue française, which highlighted the artistic, literary, and scientific contributions of French-speaking members of the Jewish community to the host society. A good number of these people were part of the wave of immigration from the Maghreb and the Mashrek and other former French-speaking colonies. It is interesting to note that the editor of the Cahiers was another member of Sherit Israel, the well-known Iraqi-born novelist Naim Katan. Meyer's position served as a launching pad for his involvement in the larger community. To that effect, in 1978, he became a member of Quebec's Immigration Advisory Council. As an immigrant himself, he was particularly sensitive to the challenges of settling in a new land. Jacques Couture, who was Quebec's Minister of Immigration at the time of Meyer's appointment, noted that Meyer worked, quote, for the benefit of all Quebecers, end quote, with a view of helping new immigrants integrate into Quebec society. Meyer himself was an exemplar of successful integration, while never for a second forsaking his Jewish identity. Subsequently, Meyer sat in an advisory capacity on the Conseil supérieur de l'éducation. As a member of the Comité des affaires interconfessionnelles et interculturelles at the Conseil, Meyer helped to draft the Jewish community position concerning access to public education. This led to the publication by the Conseil of a controversial report entitled L'école et les enfants de divers groupes ethniques et religieux in 1979. In his brief, Meyer proposed that Jewish students be exempted from religious education in the public system and that, quote, tout programme de formation morale et religieuse d'inspiration juive soit dispensé par des enseignants qui ont un haut degré d'engagement et de compétence dans cette matière et qui sont dûment accrédités, thus giving the Jewish community a significant level of control over the curriculum in moral and religious education. As a result of his involvement, the Conseil recommended that des programmes de formation morale et religieuse pour les enfants de foi juive soient élaborés en consultation avec les communautés intéressées. This was seen as a major victory for the Jewish community. In 1984, Meyer left his position at Canadian Jewish Congress to accept an appointment as a judge on the Human Rights Commission. This allowed him to bring into play his training as a jurist and his experience as a defender of human rights in the Jewish community and beyond. He remained active on the commission until his untimely death in 1989. Let's now turn to Alan Rose. He was another member of Sherit Israel, and he was in fact the quintessential personification of societal engagement. A new Canadian, Alan Rose emigrated from Great Britain to settle in his adopted home in 1957. There he joined other members of the Iraqi community who began to arrive during the 1950s. Displacement was not new to Alan's family. Indeed, his grandfather, Yahya Gubai of Baghdad, had immigrated to Calcutta in 1840. This was not dissimilar to the history of many Baghdadi Jews who established trading businesses with India and other countries in the East. Alan grew up in England and as a youth frequented the Lauderdale Road Synagogue in Maida. It was only normal that upon his arrival in Montreal, Alan and his wife Joyce, an accomplished artist in her own right, would decide to affiliate themselves with Sherit Israel, which already had historic ties with London's Sfardim and which had progressively become home to the growing Iraqi and Babylonian Jewish community of Montreal. His family background and military service were key ingredients in the construction of the distinguished public servant of the Jewish people which he became. As one of the decorated liberators of Bergen-Belsen, Alan later in his life worked to improve the lives of his fellow Jews in the Soviet Union, Ethiopia, and Cuba. The Executive Vice President of Canadian Jewish Congress, he established an excellent working relationship with governments in Canada, working behind the scenes to organize the reunification of many Iraqi Jewish families, thus establishing and helping them to establish themselves in Canada and enabling some 700 relatives in Baghdad to obtain both legal Iraqi exit visas and Canadian entry visas. From the time he arrived in Canada, Alan served the community in various capacities with the Jewish Agency, the Canada-Israel Committee, and the Immigration and Refugee Board. He was known for his integrity, decency, honor, and credibility. A committed interculturalist, Alan worked incessantly to establish viable working relations with his fellow citizens of all faiths. In recognition of his service to humanity, he received many honors: the Jerusalem Prize from the World Zionist Organization, the Médaille Militaire de la Libération, the Order of Canada, the Samuel Bronfman Medal, and the U.S. Presidential Citation of Honor. The Spanish is proud to have been able to count him among its most illustrious members. As we remember these engaged members of Sherit Israel and the community, how appropriate it is to paraphrase Rabbi Dr. Theodore Lewis's message to the Jews of Newport on the occasion of our sister synagogue's 250th anniversary. And I quote, "Go from strength to strength in making positive commitments to the welfare and well-being of your congregations and communities." Thank you.